Look, what I wanted to do today was talk about the spiritual world and the importance of the idea of the spiritual world. That's the thing that I really want to get across. It's stimulated by an experience I had in the last month. I went along and I did a talk to a group called Monash Interfaith, which I'm involved in here. I introduced Swedenborg's philosophy to them. And in the questions afterwards, we had a Hindu gentleman here who was talking about, sort of comparing philosophies. And he was talking, of course, being Hindu, talking about the idea of reincarnation. And what it made me realize was that there was no sense for him of anything beyond the physical world. For him, for someone to come back to life after death required them to come into a physical body. Okay. Now that's quite different from Swedenborg's understanding, but it just reinforced to me how important the idea of the spiritual world is in Swedenborg's understanding. And I want to talk around that tonight. I've got lots of questions, opportunity to say what you think, so shout out some stuff as well, and then I'll give you my answer to things as well. All right, so let's start running through this. A couple of books that I've come across very recently. First one is this lady, Lisa Miller. Now, I haven't read this book. This has been one of my colleagues has recommended this. And she wrote this: current psychology is bound by three limiting assumptions. 1, the brain creates thoughts. 2, all meaning is interpretation. 3, we can feel better by rearranging our thoughts. By disputing the thoughts that make us unhappy and replacing depressing thoughts with a new framework, that helps us tell a brighter story. And she continues, what if the brain didn't create thoughts but received them? What if our brains were less like idea generators and more like antenna or docking stations for a larger consciousness? What if to feel better is actually to detect and be in alignment with that consciousness? What if emotions direct us into the world as it really is? Feeling better isn't just a matter of creating new thoughts, of replacing unhappy ones with happier ones. It's also about noticing and aligning ourselves with whatever life is showing us. Anyway, jump into some questions about Swedenborg. First of all, what is the spiritual world in your estimation? What is the spiritual world? What are we talking about?
I'll say the unseen.
The unseen? Yep.
Where we go after we die.
Yep, where we go after we die. Any other thoughts?
I think it's an interdimensional reality.
An interdimensional reality. Okay.
So you can't touch it or smell it or.
Yep, it's something that's non-physical. Yeah.
Well, Carl Jung was called the numinous, the cloudiness. That he had that term for it.
We'll touch a little bit on some Jung tonight too.
Good,
actually. Right. So here's my answer. This is what I've suggested. When we talk about the spiritual world, we're talking about these things. So Swedenborg talks about it containing or being made up of essentially three parts: heaven, hell, and the world of spirits, which is that sort of intermediate place. So that's what he talks about as the spiritual world. It's where we go when we die. It is where judgment takes place, whatever judgment is. And it's also our inner landscape. So I've used words here like mental, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and so on. That's our spiritual world. What relationship does the spiritual world have with the natural world? What do you think?
As above, so below.
Sorry, say again.
As above, so below.
As above, so below. So what do you mean by that?
Well, the minuscule or the microcosm is reflected in the macrocosm.
Yep.
So as above, so below. It's like a molecule corresponds to the solar system with, to make up an atom with different electrons, protons, and neutrons. That's very similar to how the solar system operates, with planets going around the sun and then moons going around the planets.
Yep.
Asteroids here and there. So it's, I think, well, the spiritual world is a manifestation of your internal intentions, aspirations, dealings with others.
Yep.
I guess that's like the fruit of what you've planted.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other ideas of what's the relationship between the spiritual world and the natural world?
You've got to have some non-physical idea or concept first. You've got to have something that you're trying to achieve before it can show in the physical world. You've got to have something that you're aiming for, and that's a spiritual want or desire.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Joe, did you have something you want to add?
Well, I'll probably put it to maybe watching like birds flying south for the winter. It's like there's a mind that's guiding them. Like there's a sort of, they're taking instructions from, I don't know, it's instincts or whatever, or instructions filtering down to the physical world, I guess.
Yeah.
Sort of, there's sort of like a global mind, a global sort of instructions where the physical world sort of feeds off.
So there's some kind of directing
consciousness
or
conscious mind sort of directing the flow of physical activity.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, just look at nature. I mean, how do these animals know what they know?
Yeah.
Like, for just a quick example, like our elephants might move to the higher plains when they know there's an earthquake sort of coming. Like there's sort of, I guess, in touch with I don't know, spirit,
they're in touch with or something beyond the physical.
Yeah.
All right. Look, I'll wave this book at you. I don't know whether you've seen this one. Emanuel Swedenborg, Exploring a World Memory. It's quite a thick book, lots of individual authors writing essays about Swedenborg's work. And I just wanted to refer to one particular gentleman in here, Stuart Shotwell, who wrote this. For a period of a few decades, Swedenborg followed the trend of his times in detaching the natural world from the spiritual world in order to examine nature. That in order to do so, he confined himself to efficient cause, deliberately separating it from final cause. That in the theological period, he came to reject this method. That in preference, he wove causation into a rather elegant conception of the divine design that has more in common with the medieval than the modern worldview. And that essay explores those ideas. Now, he quotes this from Swedenborg. He says, "Nothing whatever in the entirety of nature comes into being unless it has a correspondence with the spiritual world. All things in nature are effects and nothing but effects, and their causes lie in the spiritual world." And we've sort of touched on that sort of idea already. I want to jump into another book, Inner Work. It's one that I've been given in the last few weeks and I've really enjoyed reading.
So just with that previous
quote, I'll go back to it.
With Darwinism, he would say it's just purely evolution.
Yeah.
And he would reject the whole thing of spiritual guidance, which is just natural selection. That's it. Just blood and bone. That's it.
Yeah.
Whereas who's saying this one here? They're saying there's a spiritual driving force.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas Darwin would completely reject that.
Yeah. So as Stuart Shotwell pointed out, Swedenborg followed that in his earlier career, that first principle of separating the spiritual world out from the natural. Ignore the spiritual so you can examine what the natural looks like. Ignore final cause and go with efficient cause. So that's path, the trajectory Swedenborg followed in his early career, then with his enlightenment, he brings the spiritual back into play.
So given the terrible state that the world is in now, this is all coming from the spiritual world then.
Well, yes, that's quite
It
right.
has a terrible effect on the way we're living now.
Yeah, it does, and we'll sort of touch on that idea again later on. Now, so this book, Inner Work by Robert Johnson, this is talking about Carl Jung, but you'll recognise ideas from Swedenborg in here. Jung showed that the unconscious is the creative source of all that evolves into the conscious mind and into the total personality of each individual. It is out of the raw material of the unconscious that our conscious minds develop, mature, and expand to include all the qualities that we carry potentially within us. And elsewhere he writes, the disaster that has overtaken the modern world is the complete splitting off of the conscious mind from its roots in the unconscious. All the forms of interaction with the unconscious that nourished our ancestors, being dreams, visions, ritual, and religious experience, are largely lost to us, dismissed by the modern mind as primitive and superstitious.
Wow.
Thus, in our pride and hubris, our faith in our unassailable reason, we cut ourselves off from our origins in the unconscious and from the deepest parts of ourselves. So look, here's my answer to the question. What relationship does the spiritual world have with the natural world? So in Swedenborg, we have the idea that the spiritual is the origin and cause, and the natural is the effect. Now he says we are citizens of both worlds. So we have a physical aspect and we have a spiritual aspect. And they coexist within us. So death brings about the transfer of awareness from one, the physical, into the other, into the spiritual, when the physical body ceases to function. And Swedenborg introduces these ideas he calls influx and correspondence to describe the relationship between the spiritual and natural worlds. And they're very, very important ideas in Swedenborg's thinking. All right, next question. What are its effects upon us now? What are the spiritual world's effects upon us now?
Well, we get bad inclinations and thoughts from hell, and we get the good ones, the helpful ones from heaven.
Okay, so it's the origin of our thoughts. Yeah.
I'm seeing it as a battle between the forces of good and the force of evil in heaven. Or in the spiritual world where both are present, good and the evil, and somehow we're getting that effect, which is both. If we're getting the effect straight from hell, it would just be hell on earth. If we're getting just the effect from heaven, it would be heaven on earth. So clearly we must be getting it from some in-between state, which gives us both. But what I'm seeing is that the people who are dying and going into the spiritual world are worse than probably they've ever been in the history of the world. Okay. More greedy, more self-centered. I think self-centeredness is at the root of it all, or self-love. And I reckon that's why we're in this terrible situation, because of the influx from the spiritual world.
All right, well, I'm gonna sidestep that for tonight. We'll talk about that. But yeah, just thinking about what's the spiritual, the effects of the spiritual world upon us now. So we've talked about thoughts and feelings. Mentioning this idea of temptation states or trial states, or the difficulties we face in life. Are there any other things that we can think of in terms of the effects of the spiritual world upon us?
Well, we have to be in touch with the spiritual world to have the effects. And I don't see a lot of people who are in touch with the
Well, we all
world.
are. This is the thing. So whether you accept the idea or not, in Swedenborg's view, we all are participants in this dynamic.
Yeah.
Now, if we don't acknowledge it, that perhaps brings problems with it.
Yeah.
If we do acknowledge it, we can deal with it. All right, these are my answers. This is what I thought of. in terms of its effect upon us now. For one thing, it's the realm of dreams. So our dreams come to us from the spiritual world. Carl Jung uses the term the unconscious, and he uses the term the collective unconscious. These are the spiritual world, and they have a very direct effect upon us. And that book I waved at you, Inner Work, is dealing with dreams and active imagination, trying to bring the two worlds together. And then the origin of thoughts and feelings, which we've also mentioned. Right, now I wanted to just share with you on influx, so something Swedenborg wrote here. There is nothing that a person thinks or wills that can originate within himself. Rather, everything flows into him. Goodness and truth flow in from the Lord by way of heaven, thus through the angels present with the person. Evil and falsity from hell, thus through the evil spirits present with him. And what flows in enters his thought and will. Now, one of the important aspects to remember is we are not powerless in this dynamic. Okay, so it's not as though we're inactive recipients. We actually have the ability to tune in to one or the other. And this is, I'll just go on because he explains how that is, what we can do and what our power is. So he says, all thought flows in through others, doing so most immediately through those in whose community they are at the time. So our thoughts come into us through the spirits and angels present with us. They don't come in through others, the ones present with us. Now, and this is where we have our control or some input into this process. He says, like are drawn spontaneously, as it were, to their like. For with their like they are as if with their own and at home. But with others they are as if with strangers and abroad. When they are with their like, they are also in their freedom and consequently in every delight of life. And this is a dynamic that applies to us here and now, just as much in the spiritual world. So our thoughts flow into us through the spirits most closely present to us, but the spirits that are most closely present with us are the ones that are most like ourselves. And that's a really important thing to realise. All right, why is the idea of the spiritual world so important?
I would say that it's life itself. That if we were just to become tempted by all the evils in the world, it'll be the end. There'll be no growth. There'll be nothing.
So you're saying it gives us some power?
It's
Is that what you mean?
It's a motivational force.
Hmm?
It's our creative energy. Look at the Renaissance. I have young kids that I know of and nieces and nephews saying that the old people were primitive and dumb and didn't know anything. Look at the Renaissance. Look at all the churches. Look at all the artwork. Look at all the best music. It was all in those days. It's look at architecture.
Yeah, the only spanner in the works there is the Catholic Church.
It's our sustenance.
Everything that was gorgeous and beautiful about what you just said was spoilt by the church burning people at the stake.
Well, that's.
Well, you think about it.
I wouldn't.
The Catholic Church is what Swedenborg used to refer to as the papists.
Yes, he called them the papists.
The papists.
Probably a term.
And that's what they were, papists.
It's
I was brought up one, and I know I'm condemning them for all the right reasons.
I think the idea of the spiritual world is so important because if we have that idea,
yeah,
all the bad thoughts and feelings we get are not really from ourselves, then we can sort of distance ourselves from them, we can reject them.
Yeah, we've got some control.
It's like
We've got some chance of rejecting the bad thoughts and not claiming them as our own, and we've got the chance to
be on our best behaviour.
Well,
well, it does with me.
to choose to align ourselves with the good side. So if we have that realization that we're not really causing all the really terrible stuff, then we can, we can reject it and go towards the good side.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, here's my answer to this question: why is the idea of the spiritual world so important? So the first thing I think, and we need to hold on to this, I think, is to realise that if it's false, if the idea of the spiritual world is false, then Swedenborg's work is entirely fabricated. Think about that. He's made it up. If the spiritual world doesn't exist, he's invented a very elaborate lie. So, go on, Joe.
He couldn't have invented it because the thoughts come from the first paragraphs that you were saying at the very start. Our thoughts are not our own.
Well, I certainly believe Swedenborg's right.
Yeah,
I think it's absolutely right. But I'm saying if he's wrong, right? If the spiritual world doesn't exist, then what he's written is a lie.
I find the
but you can't write something as deep as what he has without the spiritual world.
For sure, absolutely.
I find the litmus test to that is that Swedenborg talks directly to the rational mind.
Okay.
And it's the rational mind that actually reads Swedenborg.
Yep.
And it's the rational mind that can't be fooled.
Yeah. Okay.
And simply recognises the truth without any contest or deliberation that it is the truth. And that's the thing with Swedenborg. Once you read him, you're hooked.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, to answer that statement, I would say, if Swedenborg's work is a lie, he's fooled some very intelligent people. All right.
Yeah.
We'll talk about proofs and things later on, but I want to go on. Influx gives us true freedom. We've already talked about this idea. If my thoughts are from me, think about this. If my thoughts are from me, then my thoughts define who I am. All right, and there's no escaping that. But on the other hand, if I'm a recipient of my thoughts, then I have some choice over the mechanism that takes place. I can take a thought and I can examine it and think, well, is it me or isn't it? I can reject it. I can choose to move on beyond it.
Yeah.
And so this idea is important for me, and it's been important in my growth and development. Influx gives us freedom. The next thing is the idea of dealing with false cause. Now, what I mean by that is very often when we react to circumstances, we blame our circumstances for the way we feel. Oh, I feel miserable because, so-and-so did something terrible to me. Well, no, that's not true. You feel miserable because of something that took place in the spiritual world or is taking place within the spiritual world. That circumstance you've met, it just happens to be an external circumstance that has stimulated it in some way. Okay? The one I always go back to is that when I was a young teacher, my first year of teaching, I had my worst class last thing on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Right? A year 8 class that I just did not get on well with. And I had every Friday afternoon I used to dread. Yeah. It was always a terrible class. It never worked well. They never paid attention. Well, there was one day I changed that dynamic, and it was the day when my wife had rung me at lunchtime to say she was pregnant with our first child, and nothing could touch me. And it's funny because that day was also teeming with rain. It was a day like we've had today. And you would think that would be more cause to be more miserable. But in actual fact, I was able to use that in my favour. And I had the best lessons with that class I had all year. So dealing with false cause is really important to realise that, we tend to approach life with a fatalism that, I'll be happy when I win the lottery, or I'll be happy when this happens. But it's not true. You can be happy despite, abject poverty. And the last one, influx into effort, this idea. And I'll just share something from Swedenborg again. It is evident that one who knows that wisdom and prudence are from God and simply waits for influx will become like a statue, for he must needs stand or sit motionless with hands hanging down and eyes either shut or open without winking, with neither thought nor animation. What is there then of life in him? So it's a really important concept in Swedenborg, the idea of influx into effort. So, you know, when we make an effort in our lives, then the Lord's able to flow in and inspire us in particular ways. All right, I'm going to go on. How does the spiritual world help us make sense of our life experience?
Well, for me, it sounds like what Swedenborg said about evil spirits and good spirits and all that stuff. It's true, because I've had some weird things happen to me over the years, especially a long time ago when I was a teenager and stuff, like seances and strange things happening during those, which I completely avoid now. I know how dangerous they are. I've had lots of people being able to read my mind over the years. I seem to always end up working next to people who are mind readers for some reason. I think it's maybe they're put there to straighten me out. But anyway, what Swedenborg said just, and there's lots of other examples, but it just corroborates all these life experiences that I've had, which the physical world just by itself just can't explain.
I've got a good one. You reminded me of. So many years ago, my wife used to work at the blood bank, and she noticed on one occasion that there was this one particular nurse. And sometimes when you folk get into the blood bank, if they've not had enough food or various other things have happened during the day, they might go into a fit or a spasm giving blood. And Pam noticed there was this one particular nurse who was always on the, you know, right there with that patient before they fitted. Really? She knew it was going to happen, and she was there waiting for it. I mean, one of the things apparently when you fit is people tend to fold their arms, so it pushes the needle further in. Right. And so one of the things they have to do is hold the arm down so the needle doesn't get lost inside the body. So she was always ready for this to happen. And and we actually went camping with her and her partner one day for a weekend, and she was, and so Pam quizzed her about this, away from the office, and she said, yeah, I sense it. She just knew. Wow. And she seemed to have this connection with people, which you can't explain physically. There was no way of explaining it. And I remember on this particular occasion, we found a nice little peaceful spot next to a river to camp. And these other people came in and they seemed to be real hooligans. And she just said, oh no, don't worry, they're fine. She was quite happy, they're fine. They're going to leave us alone, and it'll be good. So yeah, you do meet these people from time to time. Look, I'll just share with you an example. Oh, wrong keyboard.
That quote there, I would say it's well, I live life just according to this. I'm not here for myself. It's for others.
Yeah.
And I'm doing God's work. Yeah. That's why I look at it. Yeah. It's going through me. Yeah. Because if I was here for myself, it would just be just money. Yeah. I had an experience just like that last week with the property thing, investment and so forth. 103-year-old woman demanded her $10,000 from a property deal that went really bad. Right. And she was determined to get it. So I had to give it to her because the lawyer said you have to pay her out. Yeah. So I paid her out. 2 days later, she died. She was 103. Yeah. As soon as she died, that very day, her daughter rings me up and says, we're willing to give you, because I want to buy a property, I'm willing to give you a 90-day settlement on the property, because mother was absolutely determined that it was 1 month settlement, and she wanted her $10,000 because I broke the settlement.
Okay.
So I said, no, she got her $10,000. Where is she now? She passed away this morning. Good, she didn't have a chance to, you know. But to 103 years old, she was, I want that money.
Yeah.
And she got it. She died the next day.
Yeah.
But I said, no, look, I'm not interested in your property. Keep it. Keep the 10,000, but you lost 800,000 that I was going to invest in. But, you know, not here just for the money. You're here to do somebody else's work. That's why I look at it.
Yeah, sure. Right, so here's my example. Another book, Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. Really good book. I really enjoyed reading it. And what he does, he talks about people who are optimists or pessimists. You know, he says that, you know, so some people are able to make a mistake or make an error and then move on and get on with life. Other people, he says they bleed all over life. That's his description. You know, so they make a mistake and they really let it get them down, and they colour their whole perspective of the world on the fact they've made a mistake. Everything goes wrong for me. You know, they catastrophize. So he's talking about how to get out of this catastrophization process. And so the pessimist, and to become an optimist. And he talks about the way you look at the world and three specific aspects. He talks about the way who you blame for things and what circumstances you blame for things. Now, the people, you know, blaming people is an interesting thing, because he says to be an optimist, you need to find someone else to blame than you.
That's what you mean.
No, if you're an optimist, you find someone else to blame for a situation, not yourself. If you blame yourself, you tend to be a pessimist. You know, oh, I'm dreadful, I'm stupid, I'm clumsy, I'm whatever, So that tends to lead towards pessimism.
Right.
So he says, you know, so the idea, to be an optimist, you need to find someone else to blame for the situations you find yourself in. Right. My question was, and my problem with that idea is that what's the difference then between the optimist, the victim, and the narcissist? There is
one to be blameless.
They all blame someone else for the situation that they're in.
But why not blame nobody?
Oh, well, that's not Martin Seligman's idea. So he talks about other things as well. But this was my problem with this particular issue. You see, there was no sense of personal responsibility here. So what is the difference between the optimist, the victim, and the narcissist? And I think it's Lisa Miller. I'm going to come back to Lisa Miller. I think that helps. Because she says, what if to feel better is actually to detect and be in alignment with that larger consciousness? That's the difference to me between the optimist and the victim and the narcissist. The victim and the narcissist are limited in their perspective. The optimist is able to look at a bigger perspective. And then again, Robert Johnson, Jung has shown that by approaching the unconscious and learning its symbolic language, we live richer and fuller lives. We begin to live in partnership with the unconscious rather than at its mercy or in constant warfare with it. So that for me was the difference. Martin Seligman's book, as good as it is very much limited to the physical world, is my perspective on this. Whereas both Lisa Miller and Robert Johnson point to something beyond, as Swedenborg does. All right, my last question, I think. Are there or can there be any proofs of a spiritual world?
Well, NDE.
Oh, near-death experience, yep.
Yeah.
The result, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah.
It's just simple.
Yeah. So a life lived with the spiritual world is better, richer, more fuller than a life lived without or in denial of the spiritual world.
Well, look, Michelangelo, he'll look at a block of marble and he would say that he would see the statue within the marble before he starts carving.
And then kind of just release it.
and just
Anyway.
work his way around it. And it's quite fascinating. When I was in Florence, I was looking at certain works of his that were half finished, and then he just abandoned. They were brilliant, but they were still within the marble block, but they were half carved out. But he had left that because it wasn't going towards his.
Oh, okay.
So then he'll start another one.
Mm.
But you can see it's
Yeah.
taking shape.
Yeah.
And he said, it's very easy to carve a statue. You just chip off what doesn't belong.
Mm. Yeah.
Which was sounds simple.
Yeah. But for Michelangelo, it was simple, but not for us.
Just chip off what doesn't belong, and you'll get your masterpiece. So I would say it's in the result.
Yeah. And
you know when you come across a spiritual person by looking the way they live, looking their result.
Yeah. So back to the question, can there be any proofs of a spiritual world? I had a couple of NDEs.
Deathbed visions.
Yeah, deathbed visions, okay. Yeah.
And people having other dreams,
Hallucinogenic.
precognitive dreams.
Yeah, hallucinogenic.
Saying something or knowing something that you couldn't possibly have known. Maybe like a 7-year-old kid remembering something from India, reincarnation thing, and they've gone back and checked it, and they said it's actually true.
Yeah, I know that case.
Lots of stories, like thousands of stories like that. Little kids learning, I died once in a horse accident over a certain bridge, blah blah blah, and such. Then they'll go back to another state, another country, never been there before, and it exists.
Yeah. And there's a couple of examples, I think, in Swedenborg's life as well, similar sorts of occurrences going on. Do you know the story of the Stockholm fire?
Yeah, the flame in his house.
So he's in a dinner party.
Yeah.
His house, several hundred miles away, is under threat from a fire, and he is agitated at this dinner party and describes to people what's going on. And then they hear the following day a couple of days later through a messenger. Those sorts of things. Yeah. So those sorts of stories that take place.
There's one thing. Oh, sorry, David.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Oh, sorry. There's one thing you reminded me of when you were mentioning about receiving or donating blood or something. Was it?
Oh yes, yeah, the nurse that I was talking about.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, actually, I fainted giving blood one day, but that's another story.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I started rambling incoherently.
Oh,
And nobody could tell the difference from what I usually do all the time. But anyway, and then I started keeling over, and she had to hold me up. But anyway, what I was going to say was, I get all these reports about people who are given heart transplants.
Oh yes.
Take on the attributes of the person who had that heart.
Yeah, they take on the spiritual qualities and the lights.
Yeah,
and
some people can play the piano and they didn't know anything about it.
Yes, I've heard.
The transplant.
It's really odd.
But don't forget, Swedenborg said that the soul is in every cell of the body.
Yeah.
So that soul is in the man's heart, the other person's heart.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, here's an answer that I've got for that question, and it is the parable Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, the reason why I say that's a potential proof of the spiritual world is the nature of Jesus' parables. Jesus told stories about things that actually happen. They actually exist, that they actually happen. So he told stories about harvest. He told stories about planting seeds. He told stories about losing a coin, children who run away from home. He told stories about real things that actually do happen. If the spiritual world is not as Swedenborg describes, then this parable, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, is the only one that's imaginary. It's the only one that would be impossible. Every other parable of Jesus would be, real world events that do happen, and this would be the only one that's based on fantasy. That for me is a compelling reason for accepting the idea of a spiritual world which exists here and now. So I'm not talking about the of the mainstream Christian view of life after death, which is often that we die, we get buried, and we await a future spiritual life. If that's the case, then this parable is similarly fantasy, because this is based on a conversation which takes place, and the rich man wants to go back to his former life to warn his brothers not to go where he is. See? So the only circumstance under which this parable would be possible is considering the spiritual world as Swedenborg describes it.
Yeah, but that's taken it literally. Margaret Mead put an interesting interpretation on this.
Oh, yeah?
She said that Lazarus wasn't actually a dead man. He was dead to society, and he was ostracized from society because he did something wrong in that society.
Yeah.
And Jesus resurrected him by bringing him back into society. And with the strength of his power, who he was, they had to accept that Lazarus was now introduced back into society.
Yeah.
So, that's a good interpretation,
Yeah.
I think.
I'm not going to contradict you, Leo. I think that's right. But just bear in mind that, when Swedenborg looks at everything that Jesus says, there is both the natural sense of it, the literal sense of it, and there's the spiritual interpretation. So it's not one or the other. For him, it's both.
Yeah.
They're both, real, sort of real things to bear in mind. And it's just interesting observation for me that would be the one that's based on fantasy of the spiritual world. It's not a real thing. All right, any questions?